Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They always said I was the easy child. The one who didn't need constant supervision, who never threw tantrums in the grocery store or broke the neighbor's window with a soccer ball. I didn't demand attention, didn't scream at the dinner table, didn't make scenes in public. Compared to my younger brother Jake, who was born loud, golden-haired, and seemingly destined to be the center of gravity in every room, I was quiet, well-behaved, and self-contained. At least, that's the word my mother used when talking to her friends while sipping wine at the kitchen island. Emily's so self-contained. She entertains herself for hours. I never had to worry about her. I heard that word so many times growing up that I started thinking maybe I was supposed to be invisible. I don't think they meant to be cruel. Most parents don't. They just forget. Not everything. Just the parts of you that don't serve their stories. Jake's story was easy to tell. He was a gifted striker by age 9, breaking local records and getting scouted before he hit puberty. He was the reason they bought the giant SUV, the reason we missed Thanksgivings because of tournaments, the reason our basement was half covered in soccer trophies and half covered in wet, sour-smelling gear that somehow never got cleaned. When he scored goals, it was like a religious experience for my mom. She'd scream like her life depended on it, wearing a custom t-shirt with his number, clutching a stadium seat cushion like it was a sacred object. She wasn't a bad mother, she was just a soccer mom. 100%, dyed-in-the-wool, breathless with pride every time her boy took the field. My dad was less obvious about it, but no less committed. He leaned back in his lawn chair with a beer and a proud, lazy smile, nodding like, "That's my boy." And me? I was the girl who quietly slipped away upstairs and practiced scales on the dusty old piano that had been in our house longer than I had. Music wasn't an accident in my life. It wasn't just a hobby or a phase. I loved it with a kind of raw, aching devotion that felt like it had been stitched into me from birth. I would sit at that bench for hours, fingers trembling over the keys, chasing something that felt just out of reach, a perfect phrase, a clean run of notes, something holy. I wasn't a prodigy, not really, but I had something. My piano teacher, Mrs. Harding, once told my mother that I had a musical soul and that with the right guidance, I could go far. My mom smiled politely, nodded, then turned the conversation to whether Jake could still make the state team after his sprained ankle. I remember standing in the hallway, just out of view, listening to the whole thing. That was the first time I truly understood that I wasn't the story they wanted to tell. At school, I was the girl people remembered only when they needed something: notes from class, a quiet partner for a project, someone to fill the gap in a group photo. I didn't mind, not really. I got used to the idea that being useful was the same as being loved. That if I just stayed quiet long enough, worked hard enough, maybe someone would notice. Maybe they'd look up from the soccer field or the family group chat that was 90% Jake and say, "Wait, what about Emily?" But that moment never came, not during birthdays when my gifts were always practical, not during holidays when my recitals were casually skipped for family obligations, and certainly not on the afternoons when Jake's carpool fell through and I was expected to drop everything to pick him up. Still, I didn't complain. I played. I practiced. I poured every ounce of feeling I wasn't allowed to express at home into the piano. When I was 16, I placed second in a regional competition that no one in my family attended. I came home that night with a plaque, glowing with a mix of pride and desperation, holding it out like a peace offering. My dad looked up from his recliner and said, "That's nice, Em," then went back to watching the game. My mom didn't even look away from her phone. Jake was out with his team celebrating another win, and the house felt like a waiting room where no one ever got called in. I started to keep track. Every missed recital. Every forgotten detail. Every time my mom posted a photo of Jake with the caption, "So proud of my boy," and said nothing when I passed a major theory exam or performed a solo at school. I wasn't bitter yet. I was just logging. Creating a private archive of all the moments they let me down so that I wouldn't feel crazy for remembering them. That quiet accounting slowly grew heavier, like a ledger no one else could see. They thought I was being strong. I was just being numb. Then came the day everything cracked. The recital wasn't just any performance, it was the regional finals, a culmination of 2 years of work. I had earned my way in, beat out some serious talent, and was scheduled to play last in the program, which meant they thought I was good enough to close the show. The auditorium was packed, rows and rows of folding chairs filled with proud parents holding phones like weapons. I had spent weeks preparing, picking out a deep burgundy dress that made me feel grown up and serious, polishing my shoes until they caught the light just right under the stage lamps. I even curled my hair, something I almost never did, because I wanted them to see me, not just look at me, but really see me. 2 hours before the performance, my mom texted me that they were going to have to skip it. Something came up. No explanation. Just those 3 words. I sat there staring at my phone backstage, the message glowing like a knife. I didn't cry. I didn't even react, not outwardly. I tucked the phone into my bag, walked to the mirror, and adjusted my dress. My fingers felt cold, but my spine was straight. I told myself it was okay. I told myself they'd make it up to me. But 10 minutes later, while pacing the hallway to calm my nerves, I opened Instagram, an impulse, a stupid reflex, and there it was, a photo of my parents in the bleachers at Jake's soccer match, smiling wide, arms around each other, decked out in his team colors. My mom had even painted a little, "Go Jake," on her cheek in face paint. The caption said, "Wouldn't miss this for the world. So proud of our champ." And that's when something broke. Not loud. Not obvious. Not a sob or a scream. Just a silent shattering somewhere deep inside me that I knew couldn't be undone. But I still played. And I played like my life depended on it. Because in that moment, it kind of did. There's a specific kind of silence that falls in a dressing room just before you're called to perform, not the comforting kind, not the soft hum of anticipation that lifts you when you know your people are out there waiting to cheer, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of realizing you're entirely alone in a moment that's supposed to matter. I had gone through the motions like any other serious performer. I arrived early, warmed up in the little practice room with the scratched upright piano, nodded politely to the other girls with their tense shoulders and stiff updos, and pinned my number to the back of my dress like a soldier preparing for battle. But underneath it all, I was bracing myself, not for the music, not for the nerves, but for the hollow space I already knew would be waiting in that auditorium. The regional finals were a big deal. Not just because of the prestige or the judges or the sheer hours it had taken to get there, but because this was the kind of event you didn't miss. Girls came from 3 counties away, dragging along grandparents, cousins, even neighbors, filling row after row with people waving little bouquets and cheering through polite claps. Every time someone walked out to the stage and the crowd erupted with applause, I felt a bitter warmth rise in my throat, not jealousy, not quite, but the kind of ache you feel when someone else gets something you've stopped hoping for. I kept checking the time on my phone between performances, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, they were running late, that maybe traffic or a wrong turn or some chaotic Jake-related emergency had slowed them down, and that they'd be slipping through the double doors at the back just as I took the stage, whispering apologies and mouthing good luck like all the other proud, frazzled parents. But I knew better. I had known since the night before, when I brought up the performance at dinner, and my mother had nodded distractedly while scrolling through her phone, then said, "Oh shoot, that's the same day as Jake's district game, isn't it?" My dad didn't even look up from his plate. I had reminded them, twice, about the time, the location, the importance. I had printed the flyer and left it on the fridge next to the grocery list and the tax return envelope no one ever opened. But Jake's game was, as always, the priority. Not because it was more important objectively, but because it was louder, flashier, and came with a crowd. When the text came, "Hey so sorry, something came up, we're not going to make it, good luck," it might as well have been a punch. I read it 3 times, just to be sure, staring at the words until they blurred. I didn't respond. I didn't even feel surprised. I just sat there, back straight, hands folded over my lap like a good little performer, and waited for the sting to settle somewhere I could ignore it. It was only when I checked social media out of habit, maybe as a way of distracting myself, maybe out of some masochistic impulse, that the sting turned into something else entirely. There they were, right there on my mother's Facebook feed. Sitting in the front row of bleachers, faces beaming, matching scarves in Jake's team colors, holding up a giant cardboard sign that said, "Go Jake," in glitter paint. Her caption? "Wouldn't miss this for the world. Our MVP." It wasn't just that they'd skipped my performance. It was the way they did it, loud, proud, and so visibly indifferent to the fact that I was somewhere else, standing backstage in a dress I'd ironed myself, holding a memory stick with my backing track and a stomach full of acid. They hadn't just forgotten. They had chosen. I remember sitting there, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles went pale, and feeling something shift inside me, not a breakdown, not even a scream, but a quiet, methodical closing of a door I'd kept cracked open for too many years. I had always told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I was talented enough, if I smiled and didn't complain and stayed in my lane, they'd eventually turn their heads and see me. But this was proof that no matter how brightly I burned, I was never going to be the fire they warmed themselves by. When they called my name, I stood up slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I needed to keep my limbs from shaking with rage. I walked to the stage under a spotlight that felt colder than I expected, sat at the grand piano with its gleaming black finish and perfectly tuned keys, and took a deep breath that almost caught in my chest. I stared into the crowd before lowering my gaze to the keys, not to look for my parents, because I knew they weren't there, but to seal the memory of that emptiness in my mind, to remind myself what it felt like to count on someone and be left behind. And then I played. I played the hell out of that piano, with a precision and passion that surprised even me, as if every note was a fist hitting something soft and yielding. My fingers flew over the keys with a fury I had never unleashed in practice, driven by the raw, unfiltered grief of a child finally realizing she had spent her whole life performing for an audience that never intended to clap. The room was silent when I finished, that kind of breathless, charged silence that falls when something undeniable has just occurred. And then, slowly, the applause began, not polite, not performative, but real, sustained, and thunderous. As I stood to bow, I looked again at the crowd, not in hope, not in desperation, but in acknowledgement that this applause belonged to me. Not because my family was proud, not because someone loved me enough to be there, but because I had earned it, all by myself. And for the first time, that was enough. Or at least, it would have to be. There's a strange kind of dignity in silence, a sense of strength that builds when you swallow enough words to fill a dictionary and still manage to smile, when you stand under a spotlight with your chest cracked open and no one even notices that you're bleeding. For most of my life, that had been my posture, calm, composed, deliberate, but that evening, as the applause roared through the auditorium like a wave too big to outrun, I felt something inside me unravel, not in a way that left me broken, but in the way an animal finally shakes off a leash it didn't realize had always been choking it. I stood there, breathless and trembling, not from fear or nerves, but from something far deeper and far older, the realization that the people who were supposed to hold me up had never even showed up to see me stand. I had just played the final piece of the night, a stormy, haunting arrangement that took months to master and nearly broke my wrists in rehearsal. It was the kind of performance that people remember, not because I was flashy or theatrical, but because I had channeled something primal into every phrase, letting years of silence pour out through my fingertips in a cascade of sound so fierce and sharp it left even the judges stunned. When I lifted my hands from the keys and allowed the last chord to hang in the air like the echo of a scream, the auditorium was quiet for a moment that stretched long and thin, and then it erupted. Not polite clapping, not the kind you give because someone tried their best, but a full, standing ovation, people on their feet, whistling, shouting, craning their necks to see the girl in the burgundy dress who had, for a few minutes, made time stop. I should have bowed and walked off, let the applause be the punctuation to a moment I'd never forget. That would have been the graceful thing, the polite thing, the kind of exit a self-contained girl was expected to make. But I didn't move. I stood there, hands at my sides, the lights hot on my face, and instead of walking off stage, I turned toward the microphone the organizers had set up for the closing remarks, the one meant for thanking sponsors, congratulating winners, saying all the safe, expected things. And then I did something I had never done before in my life. I spoke without permission. I walked to the mic slowly, deliberately, my heels clicking like a metronome, and the audience quieted almost instantly, sensing something different in the air, some undercurrent they couldn't name, but didn't dare interrupt. I didn't fumble or hesitate. I didn't smile or scan the crowd for familiar faces. I just gripped the edge of the podium, looked straight ahead, and spoke in a voice that didn't shake. I want to thank everyone who came out tonight, I began, my words crisp, clear, and cutting with the kind of edge that doesn't show blood until you're already bleeding. It means more than I can say, to perform for people who actually wanted to be here. There was a ripple in the room, a faint rustling of discomfort, as though the collective breath of the audience had snagged on something sharp. I continued. This performance, this award, this is for the people who couldn't be bothered to show up. The ones who always had something more important. The ones who never once sat in this kind of seat unless it had their favorite player's name painted on it. Tonight wasn't for them. It was for me. A pause. And maybe, just maybe, it was a little for everyone who's ever had to clap for themselves. I didn't wait for applause this time. I stepped away from the mic, walked off stage with my head high and my spine like steel, and didn't look back. By the time I reached the backstage corridor, my phone was already buzzing. Texts, missed calls, and one photo in the family group chat I hadn't opened in days, a picture of Jake after the game, red-eyed and furious, with the caption, "What the hell was that about?" sent by my father. My mother's message followed half a minute later, a typical storm of exclamation points and accusations, accusing me of being dramatic and cruel, of embarrassing them in public. As if their absence had been some noble sacrifice and not the predictable choice it had always been. But what really stuck with me wasn't their outrage, it was Jake. He had apparently left the field in the middle of the post-game ceremony, so rattled by my speech that he couldn't finish shaking hands with the other team. According to a mutual friend who texted me in disbelief, he had cried, not a sniffle or a tear, but a full-on breakdown in front of the crowd, stunned and blindsided by the implication that my success had come at his emotional expense. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't gloat. But I didn't apologize either. Because the truth is, my speech wasn't an attack on Jake, though he took it that way. It wasn't about his trophies or his crowd or even his lucky socks that we had to wash separately because he thought they had magic. It was about something deeper. Something he'd never understand until he spent a decade clapping for himself in empty rooms. It was about being the backup plan, the invisible kid, the one whose milestones were always footnotes in someone else's narrative. He had cried because, for the first time, the spotlight wasn't on him, and that light, as warm as it was, revealed shadows he'd never had to confront. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed at a friend's place, turned off my phone, and let myself breathe in a space where no one needed me to play a role. The next morning, I opened the messages, one by one, each more furious and confused than the last. I didn't reply. I didn't explain. I didn't beg to be understood. Because for the first time in my life, I hadn't played for them. I had played for me. And I had said what needed to be said, in front of a crowd that actually heard it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. The silence that settled over our house in the days that followed my performance wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace or understanding or a mutual decision to let things go. It was the kind of silence that hovers in the corners like smoke after something has burned down, the kind that isn't empty but instead thrumming with the weight of everything left unsaid, every accusation not yet spoken aloud, every disappointment still radiating off the walls like heat from scorched wood. It was the kind of silence that made you careful when you moved, measured when you spoke, like walking barefoot through a kitchen full of shattered glass. I came home 3 days later. I hadn't planned to stay away that long, but the truth is, the longer I stayed gone, the more reluctant I became to walk back into a place that had never felt more like a stage than a sanctuary. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I had already spoken my piece in front of hundreds of people, had already named the wound I'd carried for most of my life. But there was something about the idea of returning to that kitchen, sitting at that table, and pretending that things could go back to normal that felt more humiliating than cathartic. Still, I knew I couldn't stay gone forever. Not yet. Not when college was still a few months away, and the logistics of independence still depended, in part, on a roof I hadn't yet earned the right to replace. When I walked through the front door, no one rushed to greet me. No one came out of their rooms, no one called my name, and for a brief moment, I considered walking back out again and pretending I'd never been there at all. But instead, I stepped inside, dropped my bag by the stairs, and moved toward the kitchen, drawn not by hunger, but by the instinct that, eventually, all the war fronts in our family came back to the dinner table. The lights were on. The dishwasher was humming. A pot of something was still warm on the stove. My mother stood by the sink, her back to me, scrubbing a pan with more force than was strictly necessary, and my father sat at the table, staring at the television mounted on the wall that hadn't played anything but sports and reruns since I was 10. Jake wasn't there. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then my mother turned around, still holding the dripping pan, and looked at me with an expression that wasn't anger, exactly, but something colder, disappointment laced with indignation. The look people give when they feel you've broken an unspoken rule you weren't allowed to question in the first place. "So," she said, setting the pan down with a heavy clang, "I guess you think that little stunt was mature." I didn't flinch. I didn't rise to it. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said, in a voice that was steady and unshaken, "It wasn't a stunt. It was the truth." My father shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, clearing his throat like maybe he was about to play the peacemaker, but he didn't say anything, just stared harder at the muted TV. My mother, on the other hand, took a step forward, wiping her hands on a towel with that tight-lipped efficiency she always used when she was too angry to trust herself to speak freely. "You humiliated your brother," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "You blindsided him. In front of the entire school." He left the field in tears. I let that hang there for a moment, not because I didn't have a response, but because I wanted her to hear the emptiness of her own words, the way her concern wrapped itself entirely around Jake's discomfort, his embarrassment, his very public pain, as though my years of being forgotten in private were somehow less worthy of acknowledgement. "I spoke for myself," I said finally. And if the truth humiliated him, maybe it was something he needed to hear. That's when my father finally spoke. "He's 17, he said, his voice low and tired, like he'd aged a decade in the past few days. "He looks up to you. He didn't deserve to be dragged like that." Dragged. As if I had named names, aired dirty laundry, cursed them out, or spilled family secrets. As if one carefully measured sentence, one acknowledgement that they hadn't been there, had been a dagger aimed straight at the heart of our entire household. And maybe it was. Maybe that one sentence had been enough to tear a hole in the fiction we all had silently agreed to maintain, that we were a united family, that everyone was loved equally, that the scales had never tipped so far that one child had to set herself on fire just to be seen. I walked to the fridge, opened it, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, watching both of them without blinking. "I wasn't trying to hurt him," I said. "But I wasn't going to lie for him either. Or for you." My mother scoffed, turning away again. "You're twisting everything. We've always supported you. Just because we couldn't make one recital." "Not one," I said, cutting her off for the first time in my life. "You've missed every one that mattered. Every competition. Every solo. You didn't come to the fall concert last year because Jake had a practice. Not a game. A practice." She started to argue, to defend, to throw back whatever narrative made her feel like less of a villain, but I had already turned away, glass still in hand, walking out of the kitchen with a finality that didn't need a door slam or a shouted declaration to feel real. Later that night, Jake came to my room. I had the door cracked open, and I could hear him hovering in the hallway before he knocked, soft and hesitant, like he was testing the weight of the air between us. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded. He sat on the edge of my bed, awkward, looking at the floor, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. "You hate me now," he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment, unsure how to answer that. Because the truth was complicated, I didn't hate him, not in the way he thought. I resented him. I envied him. I pitied him, even, for never having to question his place in our family and for never seeing how small I'd had to make myself so he could shine brighter. But hate? No. I didn't hate him. "I don't hate you," I said eventually. But I stopped pretending it doesn't hurt. He didn't say anything after that. Just nodded, stood up, and left the room. And that, in its own quiet way, said everything. Time, people say, has a way of softening things, of blunting the sharpest memories and smoothing over the roughest moments until they become nothing more than stories you tell over dinner or fragments you barely recognize when they float back to you in the shower or a dream. But in my experience, time doesn't soften everything. It clarifies. It sharpens. It lays things bare. What used to feel confusing or complicated becomes painfully clear with enough distance, and what you once excused as miscommunication or forgetfulness begins to look an awful lot like a pattern. One that was never going to change no matter how many times you swallowed your feelings or dressed your wounds with politeness. The months after the recital passed in a haze of strained civility, a kind of cold détente between me and my parents that looked, from the outside, like a truce but never truly felt like peace. We ate dinner. We exchanged necessary information. We pretended. But something had shifted so permanently between us that no amount of smiling or silence could put it back in place. I left for college that fall with a scholarship in one hand and an apartment key in the other, grateful, if I'm being honest, that I had something to escape to. My parents helped me move in, carried boxes, made small talk with my roommate's family, and posed for photos outside the brick building like they were just any other proud mom and dad sending their daughter off to chase her dreams. They smiled, they hugged me, and they told me how excited they were for this new chapter, but the air between us never really warmed. It felt staged, like we were all performing roles we no longer believed in but couldn't quite give up. They left before sunset, waving from the car with that too eager brightness that people wear when they're desperate to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. I didn't cry. I unpacked my things, hung my favorite scarf across the window, and sat down at the tiny upright piano that had been gifted to the music students by the university's arts department, a little chipped, slightly out of tune, but mine. It was the first space in my life that had been truly mine, free of their expectations and dismissals, and I promised myself, then and there, that I wouldn't waste a single note trying to earn their approval anymore. Years passed, and with them came new layers of distance. Phone calls became occasional check-ins, birthdays reduced to texts and automated e-cards, holidays spent more often with friends or classmates than at home. I built a life that no longer needed their applause. I played concerts they never attended, earned accolades they never acknowledged, and eventually stopped mentioning them entirely in interviews or program bios. When people asked about my family, I gave vague, polite answers and changed the subject, not out of shame, but because I had learned that some stories were too complicated to explain to people who still believed that love from parents was a guaranteed thing. It wasn't until nearly 6 years later that Jake reached out again, this time with a message that was, in its own way, a peace offering or maybe an invitation to reopen old wounds, depending on how you looked at it. He had been accepted to play for a Division I team, something he had worked for with a single-minded intensity ever since high school, and now, finally, the dream was real. His first championship game was coming up, and he wanted me there, not just as a sister, not as a seat filler, but as someone whose presence he openly, sincerely valued. The message was long, full of nostalgia and apologies and a kind of humble, uncertain warmth that reminded me just how young he had been the last time we truly spoke. He said he missed me, that he never stopped admiring me, that he regretted not understanding how much it had all cost me back then. He asked, simply, if I'd come. And for a moment, just a breath, just a beat, I wanted to say yes. Not because I'd forgiven everything, not because I believed the past could be erased by a heartfelt paragraph and a football field full of cheering fans, but because some small, naive part of me still ached to be part of something shared, something uncomplicated, something that looked like family from the outside. I even pictured it for a second, me in the bleachers, clapping, watching him run across the field with that same determined energy he'd always had, our parents nearby, maybe even saying something like, "We're so glad you came," as if years of absence could be paved over with one sunny afternoon. But then I remembered the look on my mother's face the night of the recital, the thinly veiled resentment, the complete absence of reflection. I remembered my father staring at the television instead of at me. I remembered walking off that stage alone, holding my award like a torch no one cared to see lit. And I realized something essential. It wasn't that I couldn't forgive them. It was that I no longer needed to. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and wrote Jake back, not cruelly, not with anger or coldness, but with the kind of clarity that only comes after years of growing your own roots. I told him I was proud of him, that I hoped he played his heart out, that I knew how hard he had worked, and that he deserved every ounce of the success he had earned. But I also told him I wouldn't be attending, that I had a performance of my own that day, not a real one, not in the literal sense, but something personal, something sacred. A day I had set aside for myself. A promise I'd made a long time ago to stop sitting in stands that never had a place for me. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. Because I knew he'd understand, or at least try to. He replied the next day. Just 3 words, "I get it." I haven't heard from my parents since. Not a call, not a text, not even a card during the holidays. And maybe that's sad. Maybe it's tragic in that quiet, understated way families fall apart without a single door being slammed. But for me, it's something else. It's peace. Because what no one tells you is that closure doesn't always come with apologies or revelations or a moment of cinematic reunion. Sometimes it comes with silence, with absence, with the realization that you don't have to chase after something just because it once carried your name. I still play. The stage is different now, smaller sometimes, quieter, but every performance feels like an echo of that night I stood at the mic and told the truth out loud. And every time I play, I remember that applause, not because it validated me, but because it was mine. I didn't need them to hear it then. And I sure as hell don't need them now.